Probably one of the most repugnant possible outcomes to the modern, enlightened, and secular mind is to find yourself entangled and captured in a cult. But here's the thing. Nobody who finds themselves in that position thinks they're in a cult, which is one of the reasons it's so hard to get people out once they're in. If you accuse them of being in a cult, they'd likely be just as offended as you or I would. Which raises a difficult question, which is, how do you know you're not in one? Part of the problem with this word is that it's so vaguely defined in the modern world. It used to simply mean worship. It was a word that was a close approximation of what we mean by the word religion today. Cult, in the classical sense, was simply a reference to what certain people worshipped. That was their cult. And of course, at one time, everybody worshipped something, and they were honest about that. But today, the word cult has come to define specific kinds of religious communities, which, in addition to having an object of worship, can also be characterized by extreme forms of psychological manipulation, social pressure, and threat of exclusion or even expulsion for deviation from a strict adherence to the beliefs of the corporate body. And whichever way you define it, either the more classical or the more modern, I think both are a fair description of what has become of modern culture. Because if you resign yourself to the default social pressures of today and the conventional wisdom of the day and the message of the day, the one that is forcefully imposed by every facet of popular culture, you are likely under the spell of everything we mean by the word cult. Unlike those who are under the influence of a cult, most people today have no clue that they've fallen prey to it. True worship has become so foreign to most modern people that it's easy to fail to notice when we're doing it by accident. Because worship is whatever we place as our highest good. You could say our summum bonum. It's the thing that conditions all the other goods we pursue in this life. It's the end for which all other goods serve. And it's the thing we refuse to compromise when other goods compete with it. It's also the thing we honor above all else. And here's the thing. Having a supreme good is actually unavoidable. There will always be some one thing at the top of our hierarchy, the thing we value the most. And because it acquires this status of honor in our lives, it's perfectly fitting to say that we worship it, because it is the thing we ascribe the most worth to, which is literally what worship means. We can pacify ourselves all we want with comforting notions of our liberation from the superstitions of religion, but as soon as we remove God as the object of our worship, something else will always take his place. And in our case, it has. And just like members of any cult, modern, secular, non-theistic culture is under the delusion that it doesn't worship anything because it doesn't name the thing it worships. Just like members of any stereotypical cult, everyone who is fully enrolled in this one is utterly convinced that they exemplify the antithesis of someone captured by spiritual and psychological manipulation. But the fact that we are so comprehensively surrounded by it so as to become desensitized to it only reinforces my thesis that the thing we obsess over, the thing we honor, the thing we allow for constant special pleading is everywhere in our culture. And remember that the root of the word culture is the word cult. That's because our cultural fixations and our expressions communicate that which we worship, which in our case is sex. Sex sits in the highest seat of honor in our culture. We assign to it all the highest worth. We place everything else under its priority. We idolize and obsess over it. We sing songs about it. We erect monuments and banners to reinforce our commitment to it. Think about the fact that prior to the mid-20th century, the kind of music everyone was familiar with would have a range of themes that would describe all the various aspects of life worth paying attention to. They'd be about God or work or community or adventure, and sometimes about romantic love. Today, virtually every song is about romantic love or sex. I just quickly searched through the Billboard Top 10, and 9 of the songs were explicitly about romantic relationships, with the outlier only being slightly ambiguous in that respect. And every movie, every story we tell has a romantic subplot. If it doesn't matter if it's like sci-fi, romance, drama, or an action movie, the thing often driving the story is sexual ambition or frustration. Dating websites earned around $5 billion this year in the United States alone. The porn industry raked in somewhere between $10 and $90 billion in the United States. Why that range is so imprecise is probably because moral ambiguity breeds moral corruption, which will always extend to the economic dimension of life. Around 25% of all search inquiries on the internet are for pornography. That's 1 in 4 searches are for pornography. And 90% of boys are exposed to pornography before the age of 18, with the average age of exposure somewhere around 12. Every ad, every storefront, every song blaring through the grocery store speakers or the waiting room speakers is about romantic love or sex. And it's no wonder people who are single feel so desperately lonely. Like, everyone has to go through a season of being single in their lives, but our culture finds this so desperately intolerable. Just talk to any single young adult and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And it's no wonder our eyes and our ears are relentlessly confronted with the worship of love and sex, only compounding the fact of our own supposed social isolation if we're single. And you really don't appreciate how sexually explicit women's clothing is until you try to dress modestly. I remember when my wife started to be more deliberate about this as we were further waking up and liberating ourselves from the surrounding culture. But every time she found a dress, it had some compromise to it. It was either short in length, low cut, sleeveless, or compromised in some other way. Because of course, women's clothing are designed to sacramentalize our obsession with sex, promoting it in every aspect of our daily lives. And God help you, if you don't worship at this same altar as everyone else, you will be singled out, re-educated, often formally in our institutions, denounced and excluded. And there are countless examples of what I'm talking about, but I'll take one recent example because it appeared in my newsfeed. It involved an apparent feud between 2 of Charlie Sheen's daughters, one who is a Christian and one who is an OnlyFans model, who therefore exemplifies everything about participation in the cult that I've been describing. And apparently the OnlyFans model deeply disapproves of her Christian sister and her beliefs. In fact, her disapproval is so unbridled that she had to post a video publicly denouncing her sister for her Christian beliefs for all the world to see and hear. Because apparently the Christian sister believes in traditional views about sexuality and gender, views that have been universally held by virtually every culture throughout all of human civilization and history until it became our new religion. And like any cult, it does not tolerate dissent, even if that means dividing families, even if that means ritual public denunciation. Sure sounds cult-like to me. And anyone who is not a card-carrying member of the modern sex cult knows what this is like. At some point, you'll be expected to offer a pinch of incense to the gods of sexual promiscuity. And if you don't, nobody will say, well, to each his own. Like the OnlyFans sister, they'll expose you, they'll denounce you, and they'll put every kind of pressure upon you to conform to their religious cult. When I was in college, I had the first of what would become many experiences like this, when someone singled me out in front of one of my professors in a social setting because they had heard that I was a Christian and intent on reserving sex for marriage. And both this person and my professor started to just grill me for any opening they could find to persuade me away from that resolution. And why would they do that? Why did it matter so much to them what I did with my own life? It shouldn't. And yet for some reason to them it did. I think that's because my life was a manifestation of dishonor to the thing that they worship the most. This is why today it's evolved from not just tolerating every kind of sexual expression, but the obligation to endorse and honor them. It went from tolerating same-sex marriage because it didn't affect you to, if you don't bake this cake for my same-sex wedding, then we'll sue you. If you don't call me by my pronouns, I'm going to have you fired. You can burn the flag of your country. That's a right. That's a freedom of expression. But you'd better not even look at this flag unless it's out of loving devotion. And this is what happens when you displace God as the object of worship. When Europe was still Christian, the highest good, the summum bonum, the thing all other goods were conditioned by, was the worship of God and the goal of beatitude. But eventually, spurred on by the cultural fractures that the Protestant Revolution had exposed, a new philosophy became dominant. Thanks to revolutionary thinkers like Machiavelli, Locke, Rousseau, Mill, and then enshrined in the political order of Great Britain and the United States, which have been the dominant empires of the last 300 years, liberalism held that liberty or freedom is man's highest good, that all other moral prescriptions must be subordinate to the freedom of man. But it wasn't a freedom that came through moral virtue or the truth of Christ, but rather a freedom that was simply declared through rights and liberties granted by the government as if it has such authority, and then protected by the refusal to insist upon any moral truth that might infringe upon such freedoms. And to be able to make a liberal, democratic society actually function, we had to be conditioned by the virtue of tolerance. We had to learn that there would be people who would deviate from our beliefs, lifestyle, and religion, and the only way to get along and work together would be by tolerating those differences. And this notion of tolerance was often constructed upon either a soft or even sometimes a hard moral relativism that claimed that morality is determined wholly by us. And the reason we know this is because at different times and in different places, you will find moral establishments or legal systems or moral creeds that are entirely distinct from other times and places. This was and still is the undeniable exhibit of evidence offered to prove the founding beliefs of liberalism. Since there is no objective morality, freedom to define it for ourselves is our highest prerogative. But this supposed evidence is entirely fabricated and self-refuting. As G.K. Chesterton pointed out long ago, if two forms of morality are entirely and substantially different, why do you call them both morality? It would be like an explorer from some foreign, undiscovered land arriving here, and at first sight of a cat, he asks me, "What is that?" And after I answer him, he says, "Oh yes, we have cats where I come from too, except they're cold-blooded, they have 6 eyes and wings." At which point you'd be entirely justified in asking him why on earth he calls them cats. If it's entirely different, then why categorize it as the same thing? While it's true there have always been variations in moral codes upheld by disparate civilization, there has never been anything like a substantial difference. In every case, it has always described a people trying to live in harmony with reality. The variation arises from our own ignorance and varied perception of that reality. Now, that variation doesn't prove there's no reality and that we somehow construct reality, just that we don't fully understand it, and those differences of understanding are rendered in our cultural beliefs. And the same is true with morality. And furthermore, people like C.S. Lewis and Hans Kung have gone to significant lengths to research and document moral principles that are universally shared throughout the world and throughout history, and it's not a small list. They found that the fundamental moral beliefs of the major civilizations of history affirmed the same things. So even though these obvious contradictions were embedded right within moral relativism, liberalism was still able to march forward, in large part thanks to revolutionary violence, which is what you have to do to advance such a weak philosophy. And now, today, we are living on the fumes of this failed experiment, because liberty or freedom, especially a false one simply just granted by fiat by the state, as our highest good, it couldn't preserve itself in that high-ranking position. Something more enticing, something more combative, something that made more audacious promises was bound to replace it as our object of worship, which is how sex took its place. Liberalism had no mechanism to place limits on our sexual desires and impulses. You can't make appeals to the good of children or the good of marriage or the good of society, because that depends on identifying some objective good. So at every interval that led us to a culture financially, psychologically, and artistically obsessed and dependent upon sex was an appeal to the freedom that liberalism was obligated to grant. If society's better moral intuitions ever tried to place limitations on sexual license, all the perverts had to do was appeal to the god of freedom that liberalism had enshrined in the highest place of honor. That's how we got contraception, then promiscuity, then no-fault divorce, then unrestricted abortion, then pornography, then same-sex marriage, then gender-affirming therapy, which is where we are today. Liberalism is like a pacifist nation. A pacifist nation will eventually be conquered by a rival nation who thinks war is permissible, which is why pacifism will always be extinguished wherever it exists. There will always be an aggressor who will take advantage of the pacifists. Liberalism was like that pacifist who had no arms of resistance against the advancing cult of sex. Liberalism was initially embraced with the understanding that to have true freedom and to have that freedom be protected, we had to protect certain fundamental freedoms such as freedom of belief and freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Because if your thoughts and in your words are dictated by someone else, there's no point in talking about other freedoms. And that episode with Charlie Sheen's daughters comes back to mind, because the reason that one sister was denouncing her Christian sister was on the grounds that her Christianity infringed upon the sexual rights of the rainbow alphabet community. And their freedom to do as they please was far more important than her sister's freedom to believe in her religion and in a sexuality that dissents from the modern post-sexual revolutionary establishment. So notice how in this modern sex cult, freedom of speech and freedom of religion are conditioned by the jurisdiction of sex, because sex has displaced freedom as our highest good. So if you're looking around bewildered at the world that we live in today, wondering, how did we get here? How is our world so screwed up? The origin story of liberalism has a lot to do with it, or maybe everything to do with it, because at the end of the day, what is right and good for us isn't an invention of our own imagination. It's based on a perception of a transcendent reality that runs deeper than the foundations of the world. And until we learn to recognize it and conform ourselves to it, we will continue to suffer the consequences. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support. So if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca, or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.